Galactic Council deploys 12 planet killers. Humanity just laughs. The Grand Arbiter read humanity's sentence into the record at 0914 Assembly Standard, and it took him 40 seconds, and the human envoy's answer took 4 words and a walk. Ruval Anthos was writing when it happened. She was always writing. Second posting to the assembly floor, non-voting observer for the Pelhari Compact, 11 years in witness tears across 6 stations. She had filled 340 observation logs, and none of them had ever required her to stop mid-sentence. She stopped mid-sentence. The Grand Deliberative Chamber at Vethon Station held 831 delegations that morning. The ceiling rose 180 meters above the chamber floor. The stone was pale and cold, and had been quarried from the station's own hull material, which meant the walls were, technically, the same substance as the station's skeleton, a fact that the Varath Conclave's architects had not advertised, but had certainly understood. The air was kept 4 degrees below comfortable for every attending species. It had been that way for 3 centuries. Nobody had ever successfully argued it should change. The human delegation's platform sat 3.1 meters below the standard chamber floor. No warning had been issued. No diplomatic signal had come. No grace period had been offered. Ruval noted the platform depth in her log every session. It was the kind of detail that mattered to Pelhari witness observers, not because it changed anything, but because things that don't change are worth tracking precisely. 14 years ago, the Assembly Charter's procedural annex had formalized the arrangement. Before that, it had simply been the custom. She had been writing a sentence about the air temperature when Grand Arbiter Thovanos Kaladin stepped to the central dais. She had never been in the same room as him before. The briefings described him correctly: 2.8 meters, bilateral symmetry compressed into a frame that looked narrow from the front and vast from the side, skin a deep settled ochre that read, in Varath custom, as composure. He wore no insignia, just the matte black credential band on his left forearm, flush against his skin. He carried nothing to the dais. He didn't need to. His staff had uploaded Resolution 8819 to the chamber's display system at 0900. It had been waiting on the secondary feed for 14 minutes. He read it aloud anyway. The resolution classified humanity as a Tier 0 instability zone under the Containment Directorate's expanded mandate. The stated basis: humanity's refusal to submit 55% of its energy grid infrastructure to Directorate audit under the Transparency Accord. Humanity had offered 38%. The Directorate had required 55%. Humanity had said no. The Directorate had waited 8 months and then prepared this. 40 seconds to read. Thovanos had a 4-register voice. He used the second lowest for formal sessions. It carried without effort. When he finished, he activated the chamber's central projection. 9 shapes appeared on the feed. Ruval had seen threshold-class denial platforms in documentation. 28 kilometers stem to stern, each one. The Varath Conclave's designation for them translated roughly as Threshold Enforcement Asset, a phrase that sounded administrative until you understood what the threshold was. The 9 shapes hung in the projection, tagged with coordinates. The coordinate label read, Sole Outer Boundary, aimed, publicly, on the assembly feed that carried to 4,200 inhabited systems. The chamber produced 831 different sounds of alarm. The human platform produced 1, the soft, specific click of a notebook clasp opening. She already knew how this ended. She had known for 37 years. Stay close. Ruval's pen had stopped. She looked at the human delegation's platform, 3 meters below her witness tier, 3 meters below every other delegation in the room. 6 people sat there. 7, counting the envoy. Envoy Sala Varathkin did not look at the projection. Everyone else did. Every delegation, every observer, every clerk running feed verification along the upper tier, all of them turned toward those 9 shapes in the central display. It was the natural thing to do. 9 weapons aimed at a species home system demanded your eyes. Varathkin looked at her notebook. It was a plain thing, dark brown leather, brass corner clips worn down to bare metal on the lower right, the spine restitched with what looked like thick thread somewhere in its history. She held a dip pen, not a stylus. Ruvel had noticed it in prior sessions and never thought to log it. Now she logged it. The envoy wrote something. 4 words, maybe 5. Ruvel was too far to read the script. Then she closed the notebook, and the brass clip caught the chamber light for a moment before she tucked it under her arm. She stood. "Acknowledged," she said into the floor microphone. Her voice carried without strain. "We will respond in the appropriate format." She picked up the notebook and walked toward the platform's exit corridor. The 6 members of her delegation stood without being signaled. They followed her out, single file. No hurried steps, no pause, no backward glance at the 9 shapes still hanging in the central projection. The chamber doors registered their exit at 09:15 Assembly Standard. Ruvel wrote what she saw. Then she wrote. She smiled. Not at anyone in the room, just at the room. "I have been a witness observer for 11 years, and I have never seen that expression in this chamber before." She underlined the last sentence. She had never underlined anything in 340 logs. 37 years earlier. Not the chamber, not the station. A different kind of room entirely, a sub-level conference room in Lusaka, in a building that looked from the outside like a municipal records annex. Inside, a long table, 6 chairs, 7 people. A coffee pot on a warming plate near the door that had been running since 6 in the morning. The coffee was not good. Nobody had complained about this in the 2 hours they had been meeting, which told you something about the kind of people in the room. The table had 1 document on it, a single printed page, centered, no cover. The first line read, "They will eventually classify us. The question is whether the classification will find us empty-handed." The woman who had written it sat at the far end of the table. Sala Varathkin was 31 years old then, 2 years into her Accord diplomacy posting, and she had brought a notebook to the meeting, dark brown leather, brass corner clips still bright, the spine unmarked. The first page was blank. She had written nothing in it yet. She did not introduce herself. Everyone in the room already knew who she was. She introduced the document instead, by reading the first line aloud and then setting it down. "The rest of it," she said, "is logistics." Then she introduced the room. Dr. Yavin Issel sat to her left, systems architect, formerly with the Accord's Navigational Treaty Office, currently listed on no active roster anywhere. He spoke in numbers and logistics, and had, in Ruvel's later reconstruction from records, never once used a metaphor in a professional context. His contribution to that first meeting was a single printed map of the Accord's registered navigational corridors, annotated in a small, precise hand. Commander Pren Idval sat across from him, Deep Corridor Transit Officer, retired on paper, presently in the same room as the document, which told you she was not actually retired. She had designed contingency packages for 3 prior Accord disputes that had never become public. She designed them the way engineers design load-bearing walls, not for the expected weight, but for the weight nobody planned on. Dr. Myra Thesond was at the corner, a tablet open in front of her and a half-eaten piece of toast beside it. She had come from a morning session and had not had time to finish breakfast. Xenosocial intelligence, meaning she studied how political species behave under pressure, and she had been doing it long enough that she no longer found it surprising. Her files on the Varath Conclave already ran to several hundred pages. They would eventually run to 14,000. Specialist Irl Dasov sat near the door. She appeared in no Accord registry, no station manifest, no publicly available personnel record. She preferred it that way. The meeting's notes from that day listed her as SD and did not expand. Analyst Von Threat was the youngest in the room by a significant margin, 24 years old, communications background, and the junior read-in in a program that had, until this meeting, been a proposal rather than a program. He was the one who had made the coffee. He would make it at the start of every quarterly briefing for the next 37 years. And Director Sen Caldreth sat at the opposite end of the table from Varathkin, Operations Authority, Lusaka Ground Office. He had not left the solar system in 6 years, and would not leave it for the duration of the program. He would watch the resolution of everything that started in this room on a screen in this same sub-level room, 37 years later, alone with a cup of the same bad coffee. That morning he looked at the document, looked at the people in the room and said, "All right, what do we build?" What they built was quiet, that was the point. The nodes grew, the files thickened, the packages were sealed, reviewed, and sealed again. 200 monitoring installations per year, registered in navigational space under transit treaties, the Varath Conclave had ratified and not read carefully. Shell companies in 11 neutral corridors, not illegal, not flagged, just present, moving quietly, generating data. Delegation profiles on all 831 Accord species, updated every 12 months, the Varath Conclave section expanding the fastest. Prepositioned response packages reviewed every quarter, adjusted, sealed again. Nobody celebrated yearly milestones. There was nothing to celebrate. The milestone was the absence of the thing they were preparing for, which meant the preparation was working, which meant the next year would look exactly the same. Threat made tea at the start of every quarterly briefing. He had a specific mug, white with a hairline crack on the handle that had been there since year 4. Nobody mentioned the crack. Nobody mentioned that he always used the same mug. It was the kind of thing you notice and then stop noticing, which is different from the thing going away. Caldrath refills his coffee. He checks the wall clock 07:42 and sets the mug on the edge of the table. Issel opens his briefing file. Year 37, Issel says. He does not say it to mark the occasion. He says it because it is the header on the file and he reads headers. He reads the numbers in order. 4,200 monitoring nodes. 1,190 intercepted Varath Conclave internal communications. 290 shell transit corridors across 11 neutral zones. 84 prepositioned response packages, each one keyed to a single authorization phrase, each one dormant until that phrase arrives. 3 of the 84 are specifically designed for threshold-class denial platforms. We have contingencies for 11, Commander Adval says, looking at the deployment map. She is not alarmed. She notes it the way an engineer notes a load figure that comes in below the ceiling. They'll show 9. Nobody asks how she knows it will be 9. Nobody has to. She has been calculating Varath response speeds and asset deployment patterns for 34 years. The number 9 is not a guess. The briefing takes 11 minutes. Nobody in the room has slept. Back in the chamber, Ruvel was still writing. She was writing because that was what witness observers did, and because the alternative was to put the pen down and stare at the 9 shapes on the central projection like everyone else, and she had decided 11 years ago that she would not be the kind of observer who stared. She recorded. She described. She did not conclude, but she had stopped once, mid-sentence, to watch Varathken walk out, and she was aware that the stop would show in her log as a gap between 2 clauses, and she would have to explain it in her quarterly review, and she was not sure yet what she would say. The 9 platforms were still on the feed. The Varath Conclave's legal delegation had moved to the primary floor to file the formal activation notice for Resolution 8819. Thavanas had returned to his delegation's tier, first row, center, directly above the now empty human platform. He sat with his credential band visible, skin still a settled ochre. Nothing about him suggested the last 15 minutes had been unusual. That was the tell, Ruvel wrote. She had been watching Varath officials long enough to know. The ochre skin was not the neutral state. The ochre was effort. The gray was what came through when the effort failed. She wrote that down and then crossed it out. Conclusions were not her job. What was her job? The assembly clerk had confirmed at 09:22 that the human delegation's exit was logged as a formal walkout, not a procedural withdrawal. The difference mattered. A procedural withdrawal paused the resolution. A formal walkout acknowledged it. The human delegation had, on the record, acknowledged Resolution 8819 and indicated they would respond in the appropriate format. Nobody in the chamber knew what format that was. Ruvel wrote down the question. She had learned in 11 years that the questions she couldn't answer in real time were the ones worth keeping. The session adjourned at 09:45. 45 with the resolution entered into the record. 96 hours until the chamber reconvened for the response window. The Varath Conclave's delegation filed out in good order. The human platform was empty. The notebook was gone. The freight carrier Aldrin's Passage was a mid-tier transit vessel, docked at Vethon Station's secondary berth, not the diplomatic berth, not the commercial berth, the secondary berth, used primarily by long-haul freight operators and the occasional survey crew. It had a functional docking seal, basic life support rated for 11 species, and no listed diplomatic affiliation in the station's registry. That last part was the point. Varath Ken's team moved there within 2 hours of the session's close. No announcement, no forwarding address left with the assembly clerk's office, no permanent room booked at any station facility. The Varath Conclave had dedicated 3 staff members to monitoring human diplomatic movements on Vethon Station. Those 3 staff members spent the next 6 hours checking every registered diplomatic compound, 12 hotels, and 2 waiting lounges before one of them thought to check the secondary berth manifest. By then, the team had been aboard Aldrin's Passage for most of the day. The ship smelled the way all mid-tier transit vessels smelled, recycled coolant with an undertone of old rubber sealing, and whatever cargo the previous operator had moved last. The floor vibrated at a low, constant frequency from the docked engine systems, the kind of vibration you stopped noticing after 20 minutes. Issel had taken the communications terminal. Edval had the deployment map spread across the cargo table. Thesond was in the corner with her tablet, and a second tablet, and a printed reference stack she had carried aboard in a courier bag. Varath Ken sat at the table's center and did not open the notebook. She was reading something on a tablet, the Accord Charter's appendices. Ruvel would later determine from the timestamp logs, though she could not have known this in the moment. She read for a long time. She made no notes. At 18:30, Thesond looked up from her tablet. She did not speak immediately. She finished chewing something from a foil wrapper, a travel ration, flat and brown, the kind that came 12 to a pack in emergency supply crates. Then she set the wrapper down very carefully on the edge of the table. "There's a provision," she said. Issel looked up from his terminal. Edval's pen stopped on the deployment map. "Charter Article 441, Thesond said. "It's been in the document for 200 years. Nobody's ever activated it because you need 10 co-signatory species and a non-voting witness signature and authenticated evidence submitted to Subregistry Level 4. 10 species on one filing, all in the same window." She paused. Nobody had ever managed to get 10 species to agree on anything at the same time. The room was quiet for a moment. "How long is the window?" Edval asked. 96 hours from the formal designation. Nobody said anything. The engine vibration ran through the deck. Someone's equipment pinged once and went silent. "We need a witness," Varath Ken said. It was not a question. It was the next item on the list. The request went to Dr. Myra Thesond, who sent one encrypted contact signal at 1914 from aboard Aldrin's Passage. The recipient was not logged in any human diplomatic registry. She was not logged in most registries at all. The Pelhari Compact's non-voting observers occupied a category of assembly participant that the major blocks had over the centuries found convenient to treat as furniture. Present, noted, unremarkable. Elder observer Von Thesara was 310 years old. She had been a non-voting witness observer since before the Varath Conclave's current Grand Arbiter had been born. She had attended more assembly sessions than any other living participant. She had access to private channels across all tiers, cross-species institutional relationships spanning 2 centuries, and crucially, the Accord's highest-tier witness certification, which meant her signature on a legal filing carried the same authentication weight as a sitting assembly officer. She also had, for the past 4 years, been reading human history. Thesond had given it to her, all of it full archive access, unrestricted. 3 years ago, Thesara had asked, and Thesond had given her everything without asking why. They had met 3 times in person since. They had not discussed what Thesara had read. They had discussed other things carefully, and the fact that Thesara kept requesting more archive access had told Thesond what she needed to know. The reply to the encrypted signal came in 40 minutes. It read, "I'm coming to you, alone." She arrived at Aldrin's passage on foot, through the secondary berth's crew access corridor, carrying nothing. No bag, no documentation, no assistant. She was tall for a Pelhari, not tall by galactic standards, but tall for her compact, which ran shorter than most bipedal species. She moved with the particular unhurry of someone who had stopped performing urgency several centuries ago. She sat down at the table across from Varath Ken. She looked at the notebook. She looked at Varath Ken. "I've been reading," she said. Her sentence structure was long and careful, built the way you build an argument rather than a conversation. Every war your species started, every accounting you made afterward. You kept records of what you did and what it cost and what you would have done differently, and you published them, which means you were not trying to hide them, which means the accounting was genuine. She folded her hands on the table. Your species does not fear being destroyed. You have already practiced surviving yourselves. She paused. "What do you need?" The window was 96 hours. Thesara took 71 of them. Not to negotiate. There was no negotiation. She was not offering the 9 species a deal. She was offering them a document. What the document contained was not the monitoring network's existence or its methods. She did not tell them how it had been built, or who had built it, or what it had cost. She told them what it had found. She went to the Pelhari compact first. Then the Duvari network distributed. No central seat, consensus-based decisions that moved slowly until they moved all at once. Then the Omesi passage, generationship population, no home system, and therefore no fixed asset for the Directorate to hold. The Thurak remnant, technically autonomous since their Varath stewardship ended, practically surveilled ever since, possessing a detailed institutional knowledge of Varath administrative methods that no other species could match. The Kelvesi matriarchy, aquatic, attending via proxy delegate, their bioluminescent session logs outside the standard data integrity challenge framework. 4 more. Species with no tier above 4, no formal assembly voting weight, no military assets worth counting on a Varath strategic map. Each delegation received a summary file. Thesara delivered them in person, or as close to in person as the station's layout allowed. The Duvari network's nearest collective presence was a transit hub 7 corridors from the secondary berth. She walked. She did not tell them how the monitoring network worked. She told them what it found. She told them what the numbers were. Then she stopped talking. None of them were in the same room, Ruvel would write in her observer log, reconstructing from access records and station corridor timestamps 3 days later. All of them had the same number in their files, the exact amount they had each been made to lose under Directorate resolution. The exact amount, not an estimate. The Duvari network's response arrived first. Unanimous collective action, their threshold reached, which meant the commitment was irreversible. The Omesi passage responded within the hour. Their archivist sent a single note alongside the signature. "We have the session records. 3 timestamps you will need." Each delegation read the file. Each delegation signed within the 71 hours. 9 species, none of them powerful, all of them precise. The provision had existed in the Charter for 2 centuries. It required 10 co-signatures. Nobody had ever used it because nobody had ever had 10 species willing to sign the same document on the same day, until the day someone walked out of the chamber without flinching. The filing clerk at sub-registry level 4 was named Asilvar. Ruvel found this out later from the processing log. She noted it because nobody else did. His name appeared once in the authentication chain, and then the record moved on to the filing itself, which was the part everyone cared about. He processed the Article 441 submission at 0340 Assembly Standard. The filing had come through the standard intake channel, flagged for priority review under Charter provisions, submitted with a non-voting witness signature and a full authentication docket. Asilvar checked the signature first, then the docket, then the co-signatory list 9 species, each with a verified submission timestamp, each within the 96-hour window. He ran the authentication verification once, got a clean result, and ran it again because he had never processed an Article 441 before, and he wanted to be sure he was reading it right. He was reading it right. His notation in the processing log read, verified, unusual, forwarded per statute. Then he went back to the rest of his intake queue, because there were 14 other submissions waiting, and none of them were going to file themselves. Ruvel was asleep when it happened. She had gone back to her observer quarters at midnight and set an alarm for 0600. At 04:17, her terminal made a sound, a low tone, the kind the Pelhari Compact's witness network used for flagged procedural events, and she sat up in the dark and read the notification. Article 441, Counter-Testimony Submission, filed 0340 Assembly Standard, authentication confirmed, window active. She read it twice. Then she opened her observation log from the day of the designation and checked the timestamp on Resolution 8819, entered into the record at 0914. 96-hour window from formal designation meant the window closed at 0914 on day 4. The filing had come in at 0340 on day 4. She picked up her pen. She wrote one line in her log and then stopped. The filing was complete before they woke up. She sat with that for a moment. The room was dark except for the terminal light. Outside the port, Vethon Station's secondary berth array was visible, docked vessels, running lights, the long shape of a mid-tier transit carrier she now recognized as Aldrin's Passage. The light in the carrier's forward section was on. She wrote a second line. I do not think anyone on that ship slept. The Varath Conclave's legal team found out at 03:58. Ruvel did not know this at the time. She pieced it together from the sub-registry's access logs, which became part of the public record after the tribunal proceedings began. The legal team had been monitoring the sub-registry intake channel as a precaution, a standard precaution, the kind you take when you have filed 14 resolutions and never had one challenged. At 03:58, someone on that team read the 0340 notification and understood what it meant. They filed a preemptive objection at 03:59. 1 minute later, the objection was a procedural block, a mechanism the Containment Directorate had used successfully against Tier 4 species twice in the previous 40 years. It required filing before the counter-testimony's formal activation window closed. The sub-registry's automated system processed the objection at 04:01 and returned a single reply. Counter-testimony activation window closed 0340, filing complete. Objection outside window. No action taken. Ruvel read the automated response 3 times. Then she wrote in her log, Commander Adval's preposition packages assumed a 22-minute Varath legal response time. The objection arrived 18 minutes after the filing. She had 4 minutes of margin. She appears to have used none of them. She underlined the last sentence. It was the second time she had underlined anything in 11 years of logs. Dawn on Vethon Station was a lighting cycle, not a sunrise. The corridor panels shifted from low amber to standard white over 40 minutes, gradual enough that most species could adjust without discomfort. At 0612, Dr. Yavin Issel completed his final verification pass on the authentication chain. He checked the monitoring node data against the transit treaty registration records. He checked the timestamp chain against the Olmesy Passage Archive's 3 corroborating entries. He checked the Thurak Remnant's internal procedure records against 2 of the intercept authentication chains and found them confirmed on both counts. He said nothing when he finished. He sent Varathkin a message, 1 word, ready. 7 hours before the chamber reconvened, Adval pulled up the deployment map for the last time. 9 shapes on the tactical feed, the same 9 that had appeared on the Assembly's central projection 2 days ago, tagged to Sol's outer boundary. She looked at them for about 30 seconds. Then she closed the map. She had contingencies for 11. The point was not the number. The point was the 84 preposition packages, each one keyed, each one waiting for the authorization phrase that would never need to be sent. The threshold-class platforms would not fire, not because they couldn't, but because the tribunal jurisdiction would freeze Varath military authority before any launch order could be processed. The weapon had already been deployed. It had been deployed at 0340 in Sub-Registry Level 4 by a clerk named Var who had run the verification twice because he wanted to be sure. Adval folded the map along its original creases. She put it in the courier bag. She zipped the bag closed. No warning, no fleet action, no shot fired. That was the contingency they had planned for. That was the one that had always been most likely if everything else held. Everything else had held. Ruvel arrived at the chamber at 0830. She was the first observer in the witness tier. She wanted her seat, and she wanted her log open, and she wanted to be writing before anyone else walked through the doors because she had a feeling, not a conclusion, just a feeling, which she noted in her log and then noted that she was noting it, that this session was going to require her full attention from the first minute. She checked the seating arrangement. The human platform was still 3.1 meters below chamber floor. Nobody had changed that. She wrote it down. Grand Arbiter Varath Conclave arrived at the central dais at 0858, 2 minutes early. In Varath protocol, 2 minutes early was a signal, it said. I am prepared, I am not concerned, the outcome of this session is already determined. His skin was deep ochre. His credential band was flush against his left forearm. He carried nothing. He stood at the dais and waited. Ruvel's pen moved. Envoy Sala Varathkin arrived at 0900 precisely. She came through the platform corridor at the same pace she had left it 2 days ago, unhurried, not slow. She was carrying the notebook and a plain folder, dark gray, unmarked. She walked to the human platform. She went down the 3 steps. She set the notebook on the table and opened it. She did not look up. She did not speak first. The counter-testimony feed was registered under Article 441, processed by Sub-Registry Level 4, authenticated across 3 independent verification layers, and witnessed by Elder Observer Von Thesara of the Pelhari Compact. Varathkin activated it from the terminal at the platform's edge. It opened on the assembly's secondary display, adjacent to the primary feed, smaller, but visible from every tier. 11 minutes. The Grand Deliberative Chamber at Vethon Station had, according to its acoustic records, produced continuous biological noise at every formal session in its 300-year history. Species breathing, adjusting, shuffling documentation, speaking in low tones to their delegation neighbors. The background level varied, louder during contested votes, quieter during readings, but the baseline had never registered 0. For 11 minutes, it registered 0. 831 delegations watched the feed. The Varath Conclave's intercepts played in sequence. Internal communications, session notes, authorization trails. Dates and timestamps ran along the bottom of the display. Ruvel watched Thavanas watch the feed. His skin began to shift at the 4-minute mark. Not dramatically, a shade lighter. The ochre going gray at the edges, the way a color does when you add white to it without mixing it properly. In Varath custom, this read as composure. In practice, she had learned it was the opposite. The ochre was effort. The gray was what came through when the effort ran out. She wrote it down this time. She did not cross it out. The feed ended at 0922. Before Varathkin could speak, Thavanas stood. He opened his lowest vocal register. He began a sentence. Varathkin said, into the floor microphone, to the chamber, to the secondary feed, to the 4,200 inhabited systems carrying the Assembly's common broadcast. We did not file a complaint. We filed a conclusion. There is a difference, and the Conclave spent 37 years helping us make it airtight. Thavanas stopped. The sentence he had begun remained unfinished. She straightened the folder once, set it parallel to the table's edge, the way you set something down when you want the placement to be exact. Then she slid it across the lowered table. Paper. Printed. The sound it made on the composite stone surface was a dry scrape, specific and brief, and it was the only sound in the chamber. Inside the folder, a formal accountability tribunal filing. Grand Arbiter Varath Conclave named respondent. The Varath Conclave's Containment Directorate leadership named respondents. co-signed by 9 species, witnessed by Elder Observer von Thessara, filed under 6 separate Accord statutes, each cited in full, each statute's original ratification date listed beside it. Several of the statutes had been written by the Varath Conclave's own legal staff. Thavanos did not finish his sentence. He sat down. Ruvel stopped writing. 4 seconds. She counted them. Then she picked up the pen and wrote the moment twice, from 2 slightly different angles, the way she always did when something surprised her badly enough to make her stop. The second version was better. She kept both. D2 landed on the assembly feed at 0924, automatically, per the Article 441 activation schedule. The intercepts, now authenticated and public, showed the Tier 0 designation for humanity drafted 26 months before humanity had declined the Transparency Accord. The declination had not caused the designation. It had been the scheduled occasion, a trigger event, planned in advance, waiting for the right moment to be deployed. The intercepts showed the specific session where Thavanos had reviewed the designation draft and approved the timeline. He was present in the chamber when it played. Ruvel did not look at him. She had already noted the skin shift. She wrote instead about the feed, the dates, the document references, the gap between the designation's drafting and the decline that was supposed to have caused it. 26 months. The Varath Conclave had been building this before humanity had given them a stated reason. One of the smaller delegations in the upper tier, Ruvel could not identify which one from her position made a sound. A single short sound, not quite a word. Then silence again. D3 followed at 0928. The 9 threshold-class denial platforms recalled under tribunal jurisdiction. All Varath Conclave military authority frozen pending proceedings. 14 days to full recall. They would not fire. The freeze was automatic under the statute, built into the same charter provisions the Conclave had written 2 centuries ago, for a situation they had not imagined would apply to them. The platforms did not fire. Ruvel wrote, "I stopped writing for 4 seconds. I have written it twice since." Then she wrote, "He did not finish his sentence. Nobody has logged what it was going to be." The session adjourned at 10:07. The Varath Conclave's legal delegation requested a procedural continuance. It was granted, routine, no drama, the machinery of the Accord continuing to function even as the tribunal referral was being processed in parallel. The 831 delegations filed out in the usual order, tier by tier, the way they always did. Thavanos left without speaking to anyone. His skin was pale gray. Ruvel stayed in the witness tier for 17 minutes after the chamber emptied. She finished her log. She checked her entries, all 340 of them, minus the one she had underlined, minus the 2 versions of the 4-second stop, minus the 1 line she had written at 04:17 in her dark quarters when she realized the filing had been complete before anyone woke up. She read them in order. She did not change anything. She left the chamber at 10:24. Vethon Station's transit connections to Earth ran through a relay point 11 hours out. Varathkin took a standard freight passage, not a diplomatic vessel, not a charter, a scheduled freight run with 6 other passengers and cargo in the lower hold. The passage took 3 days. Ruvel did not know this until later. She pieced it together from transit logs, the way she pieced most things together. What she knew from the station's outbound manifest was that Varathkin left Vethon Station 18 hours after the session. She left alone, ahead of the rest of her team. She carried the notebook and 1 bag. The bag was the same size as when she had arrived. Lusaka in the rainy season was particular. The rain came in from the west in long, steady sheets, not heavy but constant, the kind that soaked through things gradually rather than all at once. It had been raining for 4 days when Varathkin arrived at the ground office. The building looked from outside like a municipal records annex. It had always looked that way. That was the point. Director Sen Caldrath was at the entrance when she arrived. He had been watching on the screen in the sub-level room, the same chair, the same bad coffee that had been running since before anyone in the program could remember. He had watched the session feed. He had watched the counter-testimony play. He had watched the folder slide across the stone table and had heard, through his terminal's audio, the specific dry scrape it made. He met her at the entrance. They did not speak immediately. They stood for a moment in the doorway, rain behind her, the building's old climate control humming somewhere above them. Then they walked inside. The sub-level room was at the end of the main corridor, past the record stacks and the equipment alcove and the wall with the steel panel set flush with the plaster. 41 names. No ranks. No titles. No dates. Just names engraved in a plain font, spaced so that none of them touched. The dead did not need to be sorted. One name near the top, a woman who had died of a degenerative condition in year 14, before the node network had reached 100 installations. 3 names in a cluster near the middle, a transit accident in year 22. The rest scattered across the panel, some of age, some with gaps in the program records where a cause of death should have been and wasn't, for reasons that remained classified. Their contributions were in the filing. Their names were here. Varath read every name aloud. Alone, she took 12 minutes. Caldrath waited in the corridor. She read them once from top to bottom in order, not for the benefit of anyone listening, for the names. She set the notebook on the small table in front of the steel panel when she was done. Open, for the first time she left it open. The last page held 2 things. At the top, in ink that had dried long enough to have darkened from black to a deep brown, 4 words, written in the Vethon station chamber, 37 years after the founding document and 4 hours before she had boarded a freight vessel home. Below the 4 words, in the same dip pen hand but written across different years and in different light, in the ink that takes longer to make and longer to dry, 41 names. 1 added per person, at each quarterly briefing where the number changed. She did not close the notebook. Finished things do not need to be closed. Outside, Caldrath asked, when she came back to the corridor, what happened now. She thought about it. The rain was steady on the roof panels above them, that specific sound, flat and even, like something very patient making a very small point. The tribunal proceedings will take years, she said. The tier system is suspended pending review. The platforms are under freeze order. The Conclave's legal staff will find 12 different arguments about jurisdiction and 8 of them will be technically valid and none of them will matter, because the charter text is what it is and we filed under the right statutes. She paused. The Conclave thought we were building leverage. We were building a record, 37 years of monitoring, documenting, and filing correctly. That is not a strategy. That is what you do when you know you will eventually need to be believed. You make sure you can prove it first. She looked at the wall panel, the 41 names. We are not here because we were stronger. We are here because we were more accurate. Caldrath did not say anything. He had a mug in his hand, the coffee, still going, same pot by the smell of it. He looked at the panel. He looked at the corridor toward the exit. Within 90 days, the Assembly's administrative body would remove the 3.1-meter platform depth from the procedural annex. No instruction would be given. No species would request it. The administrative notation in the record would read, procedural correction, long-standing. That was all. But that was 90 days from now. Right now it was raining, and the building was quiet, and there were 41 names on a steel panel in a records annex in Lusaka, and in the room at the end of the corridor, a notebook lay open on a table with 4 words at the top of the last page and 41 names below them. The ink was 37 years old on the oldest entry. It had been patient longer than the Conclave had been certain.